Previously on Made by Chance, we broke down a whole bunch of plywood, we made a whole bunch of pocket holes, and we assembled and we painted the carcass for our dry bar. So we're at the point we're ready to install the countertop. What we're doing for the countertop is a slab of pecan. It's about 2 inches thick, and it's a single slab that's about 28-29 inches wide in the middle. So the one thing we have to do to cut it down to size is account for this beam in the corner. This beam actually comes out slightly into this space. So we're gonna go cut it to the square size, cut out the notch for the beam, and we should be good to go. This slab of pecan had a healthy number of splits that were already starting to form, and so I wanted to use butterfly inlays in order to prevent those splits from getting any worse. Butterfly inlay, a bow tie, a Dutchman's joint, they're basically all the same name for the same thing. When you have a board with a crack, you can use this type of joinery to keep the crack from getting any bigger. Essentially, you cut a piece of wood that has the grain going perpendicular to the grain of the board you're trying to prevent the crack from splitting. And whenever you put that inlay in the shape of a butterfly or a bow tie, it'll prevent that crack from getting any wider. Since wood tends to want to split along the grain, what you don't want to do is have the grain of the piece of inlay that you have going in the same direction as the grain of the board that you're trying to prevent the split from growing. I'll throw a link in the description below for a video that Mark from Gunflint Designs did showing how strong bow tie inlays actually are. But for the purposes of this video, basically my process was using some templates that I made of some different size bow ties, and I laid them out on the slab, traced them, and then I used a chisel to score the edges of those bow ties. I then used a router to route out most of the material, and that's where chiseling the edge of those bow ties comes in, because if that router gets a little too close to the edge, the chiseled edge of the bow tie will actually prevent the router from tearing out material that you don't want to remove. I then cut out the bow ties from another piece of material and then put some glue into those mortises and pounded the bow ties into place. Since wood glue expands as it dries, I wanted to make sure that these inlays were held well down into the mortises and didn't push up. So since I wasn't putting all these weights to use, I figured I'd put them to some sort of use. After giving the inlays all night to cure, I used a flush cut saw to trim the inlays flush with the surface of the slab, and then I used a random orbital sander with 60 or 80 grit sandpaper to get rid of all the scratches that the flush cut saw left on the slab. I used the random orbital sander on the whole slab, stepping up through grits of sandpaper from 80 to 100 to 150 to 220, and then I stepped back down to 150 grit sandpaper and sanded the whole thing by hand before I dusted everything off to get ready for finish. The last thing I did before finish was just clean up the front edge of the bar using some wire brushes, and this was just to help knock off some of the dirt and debris before applying the finish. I then cleaned the slab off one more time and then wiped it all down with mineral spirits in order to make sure that all the scratches were gone before I applied finish. For the finish for this project, I used Rubio Monocoat. This is a two-part finish. It has a resin part and an oil part, and it actually adheres to the fibers of the wood. One of the suggestions for this finish is that the final sanding be about 150 to 200. It kind of depends on the wood from what I was reading, but we finished this at 150 grit sandpaper and it looks fantastic. So back inside of the carcass that I built in the first part of this dry bar video series, I drilled 9 holes through the top using a 1/2 inch drill bit that would be used to allow 1/4 inch bolts to hold the slab in place to the carcass. The holes in the top of the carcass are intentionally oversized for the bolt. This is because over time, a slab of wood this large will tend to move or kind of warp. So having those holes oversized will allow that movement to happen without breaking the carcass. Well, that's at least what I thought. Alright, so here's some eye candy of the slab. This is about 24 hours after the Rubio Monocoat was applied. So now it was time to finally move the slab into the house, and this thing was a beast to move. Once it was in place, I used a Sharpie to mark on the underside of the slab where the holes were located in the top of the carcass. We then carefully slid it back off the carcass and set it on the floor in order to set the anchors on the underside of the slab to actually be held into the carcass. The anchors we used were threaded Nutserts that were 3/4 inch long for 1/4 20 bolts. So I just drilled out a hole where we had marked on the underside of the slab with the recommended drill bit size, and then I coated the Nutsert in finishing paste and went ahead and screwed it in using an Allen wrench. Once all the Nutserts were mounted, we were able to pick this slab back up and put it back into place, and I can guarantee you there were a lot of cuss words that were said right here. I then inserted all the bolts along with a fender washer and a locking washer, and then I torqued them just enough to compress that locking washer.